How oppressive were the British prior to the American Revolution? Well, the Declaration describes what the King of England was doing as a long series of abuses and usurpations, invariably pursuing the same end. And essentially what Thomas Jefferson was saying was, the king has put all these taxes in place. He's committed all these transgressions against us. You all know it, you see it, you feel it. And there can only be one end to all of this, and that is tyranny. Pretty scary stuff, but I think the question needs to be asked, was that correct, though? I mean, the perspective of the colonists was probably what Jefferson shared, but what was the perspective of, say, British citizens in Great Britain, or British loyalists in the colonies, or British colonists in other colonies around the world? You know, the interesting thing about the American Revolution, there's several. I'm an American history teacher, Mr. G here. The interesting thing about the American Revolution is it's taught as a revolutionary act against diabolical oppression, against monarchy, against the old way of doing things, David and Goliath story, and it is all of that. But the British had colonies around the world. The British colonized India until 1945. And India today is the most populous country in the world. And the way that they administered this humongous empire was they implemented taxes around the empire to keep everything going. So we're going to collect, a tax on sugar from these people. We're going to collect a tax on molasses from these people, a tax on timber from these people. And we're going to use all that money. We're going to pool it all together, and we're going to finance this empire. We're going to build roads. We're going to do whatever. And it was oppressive in some respects. But it's interesting, the hyper-focused nature of the American Revolution. It's interesting to see the way it was portrayed. And the way it was portrayed was that the king almost had some sort of vengeance to exact against the colonies. It's taught as almost as if the king didn't like the colonies, which he might not have, I have no idea, but that his taxes were not rooted in economic value. They were rooted in punitive nature and punishing those children he disagreed with. And I think there's a tremendous amount of value in looking at it from that respect. As a proud American, I'm glad for the way the American Revolution turned out, but I think it's fair to say that there are certain parts of it where the atrocities were exaggerated. The Boston Massacre, for one. The Boston Massacre occurred, people died, it was tragic, but right after that, you have people memorializing it and putting out newspapers and telling everyone about it. And you had Sons of Liberty who were drumming up support for revolution. You had them demanding that various officials with the British government be fired or their lives were threatened. You had really extreme measures taking place. And again, the way it's taught is the colonies and the colonists are just going about their day. They're just trying to live their lives. Patrick Henry's famous words, give me liberty or give me death, right? Like, I just want to be free to live my life. And I think the reality is somewhere in the middle. I don't think the colonies were this happy-go-lucky, law-abiding group of citizens who just wanted to live and were forced to live under this oppressive state. I don't think that's necessarily true. I also don't think it's true that the colonies abided by every law and try as they could not appease this king who was out for blood. I think the truth is somewhere in between. The Sugar Act is an interesting one. The Sugar Act is an act that was put in place long before the revolution took place, but it was never really collected on. And perhaps foolishly looking back, it was attempted to be collected on in early 1760s, I believe 1763. And by that point, the colonies had had enough. They're basically saying to the crown that you're going to protect us if you want to. We can do that ourselves too, but you're not going to tax us, not without a vote. And, the interesting thing about that, and the reason why I wanted to make a video on this topic, was the British crown had colonies all around the world. They have colonies all around the world. Again, India until 1945, none of them get a vote. None of them. None of them get a vote on what happens in their respective lands. Is that right? No, of course not. But it does not lead to revolution other places. And I think the question needs to be asked, why? Why is that? Was the king as bad as everyone said he was? In my opinion, no. He was very out of touch. His policies and actions were directly responsible for the American Revolution, but I don't think he was some evil tyrant looking to kill everybody. I think he was a capitalist, wanted to make money, and believed that the colonies were property of the crown and therefore they should fall in line. And I think when you view it in that respect, the revolution becomes much more fascinating. There's a moral equivalency that takes place a lot of times when people look at history, where they say this person was good, this person was bad, this person was evil, and this person was benevolent. And I think that's terribly, terribly boring because it's very rarely true. It's very rarely true that person A wants everybody to suffer and die and be miserable, and person B wants everybody to be happy and to get along. I think the truth is often somewhere in between. It's why I think trying to understand the nuance makes the content so much more interesting. There are stories that Samuel Adams and others exaggerated the claims of what the British did in order to drum up support for the American Revolution. That to me is fascinating. That to me is fascinating. The small percentage of people who actually fought in the American Revolution is fascinating. And I think it's worth noting that we can look at the causes of the American Revolution. Taxation without representation is the main one. We can look at them and say, maybe they were exaggerated a little bit. That does not negate the reason for why the colonists went to war. It does not negate their moral position in the war. And I think if you are taking the AP exam, I think if you can speak on that just a little bit, it will demonstrate that you have a deeper knowledge of the taxes than other students who just memorize what they were. But it will also make it significantly easier for you to write a DBQ or an LAQ on the exam attesting to the taxes that were put in place and really what the political nature was of this time period. Again, everything takes place in Boston. If the king is so oppressive toward all the colonies, then all the colonies are feeling the way that Boston does. That's not true. Committees of correspondence are set up so that everyone can feel the same way Boston does because everything is happening in Boston. There's a hyper-focused nature of where things are happening and why they're happening. And unpacking that, unraveling that, and seeing everything's kind of happening in Boston, maybe because the king's being extra mean toward Boston, possibly, but also maybe because Boston's got a lot of rabble-rousers, and they're agitating everyone, and they're pushing for a revolution, and they have to sell everyone on it. That, to me, makes the causes much more interesting. For more lessons, for tutoring, for guidance, study guides, tips, private lessons, everything you need to pass the AP US History exam, visit my website, apwithmrg.com. I'll see you there.